It was a calm, seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Crestwood. The streets were lined with autumn trees, shedding their last few golden leaves, and the small town felt as if it was stuck in a peaceful time loop. Jake Reynolds, a local mechanic, was finishing up his shift at the shop. It had been a routine day, nothing out of the ordinary. He wiped his hands on a rag, gathered his tools, and waved goodbye to his coworkers. The day was nearly over, and Jake had plans to head home to his wife, Emily, and their young son, Tyler. Life in Crestwood was predictable, peaceful even, where the biggest concern most people had was what was for dinner or whether the weekend weather would hold up for the annual town fair. Jake got into his truck, letting out a deep sigh as he settled into the driver's seat. The familiar hum of the engine was comforting. It was going to be a quiet evening, or so he thought, as he made his way down the main street, passing the usual landmarks, the local diner, the gas station where everyone knew everyone. His phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Tyler is asking when you're coming home. Dinner is almost ready." Jake smiled, replying with a quick, "Almost there." He glanced at his rearview mirror, noticing a police car trailing a bit too closely. Shrugging it off, he thought nothing of it. Traffic was light, and the police were just doing their job, he figured. But then came the sirens. Loud, piercing, and sudden. They echoed through the quiet street, cutting through the silence of Crestwood like a thunderclap on a clear day. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He glanced in his rearview mirror, eyes widening as the police cruiser sped past him, followed by another, and then another. The flashing lights turned the tranquil evening into something out of a nightmare. They were in full pursuit of something or someone. Jake's instincts kicked in. He slowed his truck, trying to move over to the shoulder to give the officers room to pass, but something made him hesitate. For the first time in his life, he felt an unsettling sense of dread. What was going on? As the convoy of police cars zoomed past him, he caught a glimpse of what they were chasing. A black sedan, weaving dangerously in and out of traffic. The fugitive in that car wasn't stopping. In fact, it looked like they were trying to make a break for it, speeding down the narrow streets of Crestwood with no regard for the law or the lives in their path. Jake's eyes widened. He had seen plenty of police chases on TV, but this was real. This wasn't some fast-paced action film. This was happening just a few hundred feet from his home, in the very town he'd grown up in. A knot of fear tightened in his stomach. Suddenly, the sedan veered off course, swerving directly into Jake's lane. The police cars were closing in from behind, but the fugitive wasn't giving up. The black sedan careened toward Jake's truck, tires screeching as they locked eyes for a split second before the car slid into a sharp turn, barely missing Jake's front bumper. In that moment, Jake's entire world seemed to slow down. The screeching tires, the blaring sirens, and the spinning wheel of fate that had just passed him by. Everything seemed unreal, but it was happening. This was no ordinary evening. Jake slammed his foot on the brake, his heart pounding in his chest. His truck jerked to a stop just inches from the curb. The fugitive's car was speeding ahead now, but Jake's mind raced. What should he do? What would anyone do in his position? Should he follow the chaos, try to help in some way, or keep a safe distance? He could still hear the sirens behind him, but there was no way he could outrun this chase. His hands trembled as he clutched the steering wheel, unsure of whether to follow the police or just drive away. The only thing that felt certain was that life. The life he knew had just taken a turn for the worse. His peaceful evening was gone, replaced by a fear he hadn't felt in years. Something told him that whatever came next, his life, and the town of Crestwood, would never be the same again. Jake's heart was still racing as he gripped the steering wheel, staring at the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. The sirens seemed to get louder, closer, as though they were chasing him rather than the speeding car that had just nearly collided with his truck. His instincts told him to pull over, to get out of the way, but part of him felt compelled to stay. What was happening? What kind of danger was Crestwood in now? This wasn't just some routine police stop. The intensity of the chase, the desperation in the fugitive's movements, it was clear that this was something far more serious. Jake glanced at the rearview mirror again, and then at the road ahead. His mind raced, torn between the immediate urge to get out of there and the growing feeling that he needed to see this through. He tried to clear his head. Life in Crestwood had always been peaceful. It was the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors at night, where kids rode their bikes without a care in the world, where everyone knew each other by name. Jake had grown up here, went to school here, and had eventually settled down, marrying Emily, his high school sweetheart, and starting a family. For years, the biggest concern in Crestwood had been whether or not the local diner would be open late enough for a midnight snack. Crime was something you saw in the papers, not something that crept into your quiet little town. The moment felt surreal, like the entire town had been shaken from its peaceful slumber. Jake had always thought that the world outside of Crestwood was full of noise, chaos, and uncertainty, but now that chaos had come crashing through his doorstep. He couldn't help but wonder, how did this happen here, in a town like this? What had made the fugitive so desperate to risk everything, to put so many lives on the line? The screeching of tires pulled Jake back into the present. The black sedan was still ahead, weaving wildly through traffic, desperate to escape. The police cars followed, their sirens shrieking, but there was a strange sense of rhythm to the pursuit, like a deadly dance unfolding in front of him. Jake wanted to turn off the road, to pull into a parking lot, and let the police do their job. But something held him in place. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something deeper, a strange sense of duty, of not wanting to be a passive witness. Suddenly, the fugitive's car swerved into an alleyway, cutting off a side street with reckless abandon. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know why, but he found himself following, his foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but something made him drive forward, deeper into the chase. The alley was narrow, and the buildings on either side seemed to close in as the sedan shot through, narrowly avoiding pedestrians and parked cars. Jake's truck was heavy and slow compared to the sleek, speeding car ahead, but he pushed it harder, trying to keep pace, as if something in his gut was telling him to keep going. He was out of his element, his heart pounding in his chest as the chase took them deeper into unfamiliar territory. The sound of police radios crackled through his truck's speakers. The dispatcher's voice was tense, giving commands to the officers ahead, but it was a jumble of noise. Jake's world had narrowed to a single point, the black sedan ahead. He had no idea why, but he couldn't stop now. He was too close. As they turned another corner, Jake saw the flashing lights of more police cars up ahead, blocking the street. It looked like a dead end. The fugitive's car swerved violently, but there was nowhere left to go. The moment felt suspended in time, like a photograph in motion. Jake's truck was only a few cars behind the fugitive now. The tension was suffocating. His palms were sweaty on the wheel, his mind spinning. Was this the moment where everything went wrong? He felt a strange sense of foreboding, like he was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The fugitive's car slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just inches from the police blockade. The police cars closed in, their sirens wailing as officers jumped out of their vehicles, weapons drawn, ready to make the arrest. But the fugitive didn't surrender. Instead, the driver threw the car into reverse and slammed it backward, aiming straight at Jake's truck. Jake's heart stopped for a split second. His truck was directly in the path of the fugitive's escape route. There was no time to think, only to react. He slammed his foot on the brake, but the momentum of the situation sent a wave of panic through him. The sedan was moving fast, its tires screeching in a desperate attempt to escape. In that moment, it felt like the world was spinning out of control. Jake's truck barely missed the fugitive's car as it reversed toward him, the back bumper grazing the front of his truck. His body tensed, ready to jump out of the way if things went south. The loud crash of metal on metal echoed as the fugitive's car collided with a parked vehicle near the edge of the alley, stopping its backward momentum. The police quickly surrounded the sit-in, but the danger wasn't over. Jake's hands trembled as he sat frozen in his truck, watching the scene unfold. He was shaken, unsure of what to do next. The sirens still blared, the police officers shouted commands, and the fugitive's car was now completely surrounded. Jake didn't know whether to stay or leave. Should he drive away? Was he in danger? His pulse was still racing, and the reality of the situation was finally sinking in. The peaceful town of Crestwood had just become the stage for an unimaginable event. As he sat there, breathing heavily, Jake realized something. He was no longer a passive observer. He had been pulled into this, whether he liked it or not. His quiet, predictable life had just collided head-on with chaos, and there was no going back. What had started as an ordinary day was now a dangerous moment he would never forget. Jake sat frozen behind the wheel, heart pounding as he watched the chaotic scene unfold before him. The fugitive's car was finally cornered, but the tension was far from over. Police officers surrounded the vehicle, weapons drawn, shouting commands at the driver. The suspect wasn't giving up easily. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, his eyes wild with panic as he seemed to weigh his next move. Jake's mind raced. What was going to happen next? The situation had escalated so quickly, and yet there was still this nagging feeling that it wasn't over. He knew it wouldn't be. The police shouted louder, trying to coax the suspect out of the vehicle, but the fugitive wasn't budging. Jake's truck was parked just a few feet behind the officers now, the distance between him and the unfolding standoff shrinking with each passing second. His pulse thudded in his ears. He couldn't just sit here anymore. The adrenaline coursing through his veins, the sirens still echoing in his mind, was too much. Something inside him snapped, urging him to do something, to take control of the situation somehow. Without thinking, Jake threw the truck into gear, the engine roaring to life as he moved forward slowly, edging closer to the scene. He knew the risks. He knew that the police were already handling the situation, that his interference could make things worse. But the impulse to do something, anything, overpowered his logic. He had to act. As Jake inched forward, his eyes never left the sit-in. The suspect's car was now boxed in, but there was something in the driver's erratic movements that made Jake uneasy. The fugitive's hands were still gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his body tense with fear and desperation. It was clear that he wasn't thinking clearly. His actions were unpredictable, and that uncertainty made Jake nervous. The suspect's gaze flicked around, as if searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. Then, without warning, the fugitive's car lurched forward, breaking through the police blockade, its tires screeching as it tore down the alley. It was a split-second decision, one that no one saw coming. The police, momentarily stunned by the sudden movement, scrambled to catch up, but the fugitive was gone, speeding off into the night. The sound of screeching tires filled the air as Jake's stomach dropped. This wasn't over. The situation had just gotten 10 times worse. Jake's foot slammed onto the gas pedal as he instinctively followed the car. His truck roared to life, surging forward. His mind was a blur of thoughts. Why was he doing this? What if he made it worse? But he couldn't stop now. The adrenaline was overpowering, his body moving faster than his thoughts could catch up. The chase was on. The streets of Crestwood, normally so calm and safe, now felt like a labyrinth of danger. The fugitive's car swerved through traffic with reckless abandon, cutting off other vehicles, forcing them to swerve to avoid a collision. Jake followed, narrowly dodging a car that seemed to appear out of nowhere. His heart hammered in his chest as he pushed the truck harder, trying to keep pace. The sirens still rang in the distance, but the police were behind, struggling to regain control. Jake didn't know if they would catch up in time, and that realization sent a cold wave of fear down his spine. The chase tore through Crestwood, past familiar landmarks, through intersections that Jake knew by heart, but now seemed foreign and dangerous. The fugitive's car was fast, far faster than Jake's truck, and yet something inside him refused to give up. The sirens grew fainter as the distance between him and the pursuing officers increased. His eyes darted from the rearview mirror to the road ahead, trying to gauge his next move. Should he turn back? Should he stop and let the police take over? But Jake couldn't bring himself to stop. It was as though his body was on autopilot, pushed forward by a combination of fear, adrenaline, and a strange sense of responsibility. As the chase continued, the streets began to narrow, the buildings closing in on both sides, and Jake's visibility became limited. Every turn the fugitive took seemed to be more reckless than the last. Jake's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his grip tightening with every second. The feeling of being so close to a disaster, of not knowing what would happen next, was suffocating. The fugitive was clearly losing control, swerving wildly, jumping curbs, cutting across lawns, and tearing through stop signs as if they didn't exist. Jake barely had time to react as the fugitive's car slammed into a parked vehicle, sending it flying into the street. The crash sent a shockwave of noise, the sound of crunching metal and shattering glass echoing in the night. It was enough to make Jake slam his foot onto the brake, his truck jerking to a sudden stop just inches from the wreckage. His heart was in his throat. He had just narrowly avoided becoming part of the collision. Through the dust and debris, Jake saw the sedan continue to move, albeit much slower now. It was clear the car had been damaged, but the fugitive wasn't stopping. He was still trying to get away, still pushing the vehicle forward as if there was some slim hope of escape. Jake's instincts screamed at him to get out of there, to let the police handle the situation. But there was something about the desperation in the fugitive's movements, something about the raw, frantic energy that pulled Jake back into the madness. Without thinking, he shifted the truck into gear again, and for the second time in less than an hour, found himself in the midst of a high-speed chase. But this time, he wasn't just a witness, he was part of it, and he wasn't sure how to get out. Every turn, every swerve, felt like it could be the last. The world around him blurred as the chase consumed him entirely. He was no longer just a man driving home from work. He was now part of a wild, unpredictable moment in Crestwood's history. This was no longer just an ordinary night. It was a night that would change everything. And Jake had no idea what would come next. Jake's mind raced as he followed the fugitive's car through the twisting streets of Crestwood. The pursuit was relentless, and he found himself locked in a dangerous dance, dodging pedestrians, swerving around obstacles, and praying that he wasn't about to crash. The adrenaline had taken full control of his body. He could barely feel his hands on the steering wheel anymore. His grip was so tight. But it didn't matter. The moment had completely taken over him. Every turn, every screech of tires, every sound of the speeding car in front of him pushed him further into a state of instinctual survival. He couldn't think, not logically anyway. All that mattered was the chase. As the sedan shot through an intersection, narrowly missing a truck that had the red light, Jake instinctively followed. He knew this area well. These were the streets where he had grown up, where he had driven as a teenager, speeding home after late nights with friends. But now, the familiarity of these roads felt strange. The sense of normalcy had vanished. Jake was no longer the man driving home from work. He was part of something bigger, something that had escalated far beyond his control. He could see the sedan up ahead, still weaving dangerously between cars. The fugitive was now desperate, the car's rear bumper hanging loose after a few close calls with barriers and mailboxes. It was clear the driver was panicking, but it wasn't slowing down. Each movement felt erratic, like a wounded animal trapped in a corner, lashing out at anything in its path. Jake's heart pounded louder in his chest. He was too close to something he didn't understand, but at the same time, he couldn't pull away. He couldn't stop himself from following. At this point, Jake knew that there was no turning back. He had followed the fugitive deep into the heart of Crestwood, and it felt like he was being pulled into something much darker. He could hear the sirens of the police vehicles behind him now, but they were struggling to keep up. The police had lost valuable ground when the fugitive had swerved out of control earlier, and now it was as if they were trailing an elusive shadow. The world outside his truck seemed to blur, the flashing lights and the screeching of tires becoming a deafening white noise. Everything was happening so fast. Jake was barely keeping up, but the more he pushed forward, the more it felt like he was locked in a spiraling descent. Then, as if the fugitive had run out of options, the sedan came to an abrupt stop. For a moment, Jake thought it was over. The car screeched to a halt in the middle of the road, its engine revving as if the driver was preparing to make a final stand. But Jake knew better. This wasn't surrender. This was desperation. The fugitive's door flew open, and for the first time, Jake saw the driver's face. The fugitive was a man, probably in his late 20s, his features twisted with a mix of fear and defiance. His eyes locked onto Jake's truck in an instant, as though he was calculating his next move. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what to do. He knew he was no longer a passive observer. He was a part of this moment now, and whatever happened next would change everything. The man in the sedan wasn't ready to give up, not without a fight. He stumbled out of the car, his movements frantic, and then, to Jake's horror, the man pulled something from his waistband. A gun. The glint of metal in the streetlights sent a shockwave of fear through Jake's entire body. The fugitive was armed. Instinctively, Jake slammed his foot onto the brake, bringing his truck to a skidding halt just behind the sedan. His heart pounded in his ears, the world around him feeling like it had frozen in time. The police had caught up now, and they were shouting commands, but the fugitive wasn't listening. The man's eyes flicked toward the approaching officers, then back at Jake, his expression unreadable. Jake could see the raw desperation in the man's movements. He wasn't just trying to escape, he was ready to fight for his life. The fear that had already gripped Jake's chest tightened even further as the standoff began to take shape. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Jake had no idea what to do. He was just a guy in the wrong place at the wrong time, driving home from a quiet day at work. But now, he was caught in the middle of a dangerous standoff, a potential hostage situation, and his hands were shaking as he clutched the steering wheel. He glanced at the police officers who were closing in from every angle, their guns drawn, ready to take action. But the fugitive wasn't backing down. The tension was unbearable. Jake could feel the weight of every second pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't trained for this. He was just a mechanic from a small town, caught in a nightmare he didn't understand. But something inside him snapped. A deep, visceral need to do something, anything, to stop this from spiraling further. Without thinking, he threw the truck into park and yanked open the door. The cold air hit his face, and for a brief moment, he stood there, frozen. But then, as the police officers shouted orders and the fugitive's gaze flicked toward him, Jake realized he couldn't stand by anymore. He wasn't a spectator in this chaos. He had to act. The moment he stepped out of the truck, the fugitive's eyes locked onto him with a mix of confusion and suspicion. The gun was still raised, his grip unsteady, but it was enough to send a ripple of panic through Jake's chest. He didn't know what he was doing, but he couldn't just watch someone's life end over this. The realization hit him like a freight train. He was about to make a decision that would change everything. The next few seconds felt like a blur. The tension was unbearable as the man slowly lowered the gun, his eyes darting between Jake and the approaching officers. Jake's hands were shaking as he slowly took a step forward, unsure of what was coming next. Was he making the right choice? Would this only make things worse? But as the police closed in, and the fugitive began to realize he was cornered, everything changed. The standoff reached its peak, and Jake, standing on the edge of a decision he could never take back, watched as the fugitive made one final desperate move. The outcome was uncertain. The weight of the moment hung over him, and Jake realized that whatever happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had stepped into something far beyond his control, and now the only thing that mattered was what happened next. The aftermath of the chaotic standoff was almost as surreal as the chase itself. Jake's body was still trembling from the adrenaline, but as the dust settled and the police finally apprehended the fugitive, a deep, unsettling silence fell over Crestwood. The flashing lights of the squad cars were now the only things breaking the dark night, the red and blue hues casting eerie shadows on the faces of the officers, onlookers, and Jake himself. He stood there, in the midst of it all, feeling like a stranger in his own town. The streets, which had always felt safe and familiar, now seemed cold, foreign, and full of judgment. The fugitive had been taken into custody quickly, but Jake's role in the entire mess wasn't as simple as just being a bystander. He had stepped into the chaos, and now the town's attention was on him. In the hours following the arrest, the story of Jake's involvement spread quickly through Crestwood like wildfire. The small town, where everyone knew everyone's name, was suddenly divided. Some saw Jake as a hero, a man who had stepped forward to stop a dangerous situation from escalating further. Others saw him as a fool, someone who had unnecessarily put himself and everyone else in danger by getting involved. His phone began ringing nonstop, with people either congratulating him or condemning him for his actions. Even his wife, Emily, who had been worried sick all night, didn't know what to think. She hadn't expected this. She had always known Jake to be level-headed, cautious, and responsible, and yet here he was, caught in the middle of a nightmare that had the entire town buzzing. Jake tried to brush off the harsh whispers and opinions. He tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing. But there was a gnawing doubt that settled deep in his chest. Was it the right decision? Could he have handled things differently? Had he put his family in danger by stepping in when he didn't have the training or experience to deal with something like this? He couldn't shake the images of the fugitive's face, the gun, the tension that had filled the air like a heavy fog. What if the outcome had been different? What if he hadn't been able to stop the situation before it escalated further? These questions haunted him in the days that followed. As the dust settled and the town began to return to its usual rhythm, Jake found himself facing the consequences of his actions. The police chief, Detective Harris, pulled him aside the following week for a conversation that was as much about accountability as it was about understanding. While Harris didn't exactly reprimand him, there was a clear sense that Jake had stepped out of bounds. "You did what you thought was right in the moment," Harris said, his voice steady but tinged with a sense of caution. "But you need to understand, Jake, that this was far more dangerous than you realize. You put yourself and others at risk. The next time you get caught in something like this, you might not get so lucky." Jake nodded, his stomach tightening as Harris's words sank in. It wasn't lost on him that his actions could have led to an even worse outcome. He was lucky that things hadn't turned deadly, that the situation hadn't spiraled beyond the point of no return. But luck only went so far. What had started as an ordinary day, with no indication of anything out of the ordinary, had transformed into a series of decisions that Jake would carry with him for the rest of his life. The media soon picked up the story, and Jake's face was plastered across local news broadcasts. The small-town mechanic was now an unexpected local hero, or at least that's how some of the media portrayed him. The reality, however, was more complicated. People saw Jake as brave, but they also saw him as reckless. The town that had once embraced him now looked at him through a new lens, a lens tinted with both admiration and judgment. Some folks at the diner would offer him a handshake, thanking him for his courage, while others avoided his gaze, unsure of how to reconcile what he had done with their own beliefs of what was right or wrong. Emily was torn. She had always supported Jake through everything, but she couldn't shake the fear she felt every time she thought about that night. She had been waiting for him to come home, cooking dinner, never expecting that he would end up in the middle of a high-speed chase, facing down an armed fugitive. She tried to understand his motivations, his desire to help, but the overwhelming concern for his safety overshadowed everything. It wasn't long before the tension between them became evident. They hadn't talked much about the event since that night. Every conversation seemed to circle around the same questions. Had Jake made the right choice? Had he endangered their family? Emily couldn't help but feel like she was living in a house with someone who had changed, someone she didn't fully understand anymore. As the weeks passed, Jake began to notice the shift in the town's atmosphere. People were talking about him less, but the underlying tension lingered. There was an unspoken question that everyone seemed to be asking. What kind of person was Jake Reynolds? Was he a hero who'd taken a stand, or was he someone who had made a decision that could have destroyed everything? He overheard conversations in the hardware store, in the coffee shop, and at the local bar. People weren't sure what to make of him anymore, and that uncertainty was as suffocating as the chaos of that night. The most unexpected consequence of it all, however, was Jake's internal struggle. He had never been a man to second-guess himself, to wonder if he had made the wrong choice. But now, every time he looked at his son, Tyler, every time he held his wife's hand, he couldn't help but question the impact of his actions. He had put them all in danger, and for what? To prove a point. To save someone who didn't deserve to be saved. The questions gnawed at him, eating away at his sense of self. The only thing that seemed certain now was the realization that his life, and Crestwood's, had irrevocably changed. That night had shown him that even in the safest places, chaos could strike without warning. The decisions he made would ripple through his family, his community, and perhaps even his own sense of identity. He didn't know how to reconcile his role in the event with the man he had always been. But as the weeks dragged on and life slowly returned to normal, Jake came to a haunting conclusion. He would never be able to look at the world the same way again. And neither would Crestwood. The moral implications of his actions continued to haunt him, and no amount of praise or criticism could change the fact that the night had changed him forever. The decisions he made that night weren't just about right or wrong. They were about a man faced with an impossible situation, trying to make sense of a world that had just revealed its darker side. What happened next, Jake couldn't predict. But one thing was certain. Everything, including him, would be different moving forward. And as he lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling, a thought crossed his mind. A thought he couldn't shake. If you had the chance to go back, would you do it all over again? The weeks following the incident were a blur for Jake. Crestwood, for all its small-town charm, had forever changed in his eyes. The peace that had once defined the town now felt like an illusion, one that had been shattered in a matter of minutes. The dramatic standoff, the chase, the armed fugitive, it had all left an indelible mark on both the town and Jake himself. But as time passed, so did the initial frenzy. The media moved on to other stories, and the police seemed to sweep the event under the rug, treating it as just another crazy night in an otherwise quiet town. Yet for Jake, the events of that night continued to haunt him. He couldn't look at the streets of Crestwood the same way. Every corner he turned, every familiar landmark he passed, was now tainted by the memory of what had happened. The town had returned to its routines, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that everything had subtly shifted. It wasn't just the whispers behind his back, or the uncertain glances he received from people he once considered friends. It was the quiet realization that what he had experienced had changed him, and in doing so, had irrevocably altered the way he saw the world. The moral ambiguity of his actions lingered in the corners of his mind. The more he reflected, the more he questioned whether he had truly done the right thing. Helping the fugitive, stepping into a situation that he wasn't trained for. Had he acted out of genuine bravery, or had it been reckless? Could he have avoided the mess he found himself in, or had he been too impulsive, too eager to act in a moment of chaos? There were moments when the doubts almost paralyzed him, when he would catch himself staring out the window, lost in thought, replaying the events over and over again. Emily noticed the change in him too. The once steady, confident man who had always made decisions with conviction was now distant, withdrawn. He had never been someone to share his emotions openly, But this was different. His silence was a wall, a barrier he had built between himself and the world. Emily tried to reach out to him, to understand what was going on in his mind, but Jake couldn't bring himself to open up. Every time she asked him how he was feeling, he would give her a half-hearted answer and change the subject. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he? How could he explain the confusion, the guilt, the overwhelming sense of responsibility he now felt? How could he explain that he wasn't just struggling with what happened that night, but with the man he had become in the wake of it? Their son, Tyler, noticed it too. Jake hadn't been the same father he used to be. He was more distracted, less present. Tyler had always looked up to his dad, and Jake could see the concern in his son's eyes. It broke him every time he saw the way Tyler hesitated before asking him to play or talk. Jake wanted to be the same dad he had always been, the man who showed up for every school play, who played catch in the backyard, who laughed at Tyler's terrible jokes. But now, all he could think about were the consequences of his actions, the lives that had been changed by that one night, and the possibility that things could have gone terribly wrong. The fallout from the incident wasn't just limited to Jake's family. The community, once so close-knit, had begun to fracture. People had their opinions, and no one seemed to agree on whether Jake was a hero or a fool. He overheard conversations at the local diner, in the hardware store, and on the street. Some called him brave, a man who did what he had to do in an impossible situation. Others whispered that he had overstepped, that he had put the entire town at risk for no good reason. No one knew what to make of him, and the uncertainty ate away at Jake. The truth was, he hadn't known what to make of himself either. He had acted on impulse, driven by something deep inside him, something primal, maybe the need to protect, to act when others couldn't or wouldn't. But what had it cost him? What had it cost Crestwood? There were no easy answers, and as Jake tried to make sense of the choices he had made, he began to understand something deeper. There was no going back to the way things were before. The man who had driven through those streets, blissfully unaware of what lay ahead, was gone. In his place was someone who had seen how fragile life could be, how quickly the world could tilt off its axis. And so, Jake found himself in a place of reflection. As the weeks stretched into months, he tried to make peace with the idea that he would never have clear answers. There would be no grand redemption, no sudden realization that he had done the right thing. Instead, he would have to learn to live with the consequences of his actions. He would have to accept that life wasn't black and white, that sometimes decisions weren't so easily classified as good or bad. He had stepped into the unknown, and in doing so, had transformed his life, his family's life, and his town's. But there was one thing Jake could hold on to: the people around him. As the town's chatter slowly faded, as the media moved on to the next big story, Jake found solace in the quiet moments. The conversations with Emily, though strained, slowly began to reopen the lines of communication between them. Tyler, though still unsure about how to process what had happened, slowly started to see his dad as more than just the man who had been involved in a police chase. He was Jake, his father, the man who had made mistakes, who had doubts, but who was still there, trying to be the best he could be for his family. And perhaps that was the real lesson Jake had learned through it all. That life wasn't about the moments of grand action or heroism, but about the quiet, steady moments that followed. It was about showing up when it mattered most, about learning from the past, and about finding a way to move forward, no matter how messy things got. It was about accepting the things you couldn't change and finding a way to live with the consequences. As Jake sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset over Crestwood, he realized that he couldn't change what had happened, but he could change how he moved forward. He could learn from his mistakes, grow from them, and make sure that, in the end, the man he became was someone worth respecting, someone who would never forget the lessons that night had taught him. But more than anything, he knew that the world he lived in now, the world where nothing was certain and everything could change in an instant, was the world he would have to navigate with eyes wide open. It was a world where nothing would ever feel quite the same, and that was okay. As the last of the sunlight dipped below the horizon, Jake whispered to himself, "I did what I thought was right, and maybe that's all anyone can do." He didn't know if it would ever be enough, but it was a start, and that for now was enough.